So hello, um, welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm here at the Hannah Arendt Center, where I'm founder and academic director. It's a pleasure to be here today. We are reading um, the postscript to Hannah Arendt's book, possibly her most famous book. I mean, likely her most famous book, Eichmann in Jerusalem: A Report on the Banality of Evil. Uh, So we've been reading this book for the last few months in this reading group, and I think we've had some really fantastic discussions about it. And I applaud you and thank you for the seriousness with which you've read it. Um, One of the things that we haven't done until now is really engaged in the controversy around the book. I mean, obviously it's come up at times, but I think I need to say a little bit about it now that we're reading the postscript. So let me say that in February and March of 1963, Arendt published 5 essays in the New Yorker magazine about the Eichmann trial. Uh, she then collected these 5 essays and published them in a book, Eichmann in Jerusalem: A Report on the Banality of Evil. Um, Even before the book was published, and as these essays had come out, uh, and even before the essays to some degree came out, because a few people had read them, an absolute uproar took place in New York. Um, Arendt was castigated and criticized widely. On the front page of the New York Times Book Review, she was accused of defending Adolf Eichmann and praising him as a Zionist. I think we've talked a bit about what she means by him calling himself a Zionist, not what she called, but that's what was said about her. She was called a self-hating Jew and a Nazi lover in the Jewish Forward. The Anti-Defamation League, a group I'm quite close to at times, sent out a 10-page rebuttal calling Eichmann in Jerusalem an evil book. Um, uh, she was accused of blinding animus and of vast ignorance by the literature professor Marie Sirkin. Lionel Abel in the Partisan Review says that in her book, Eichmann comes off so much better than do the victims. There were, of course, many who defended her book. It became really one of the greatest intellectual cause celebs of the modern era. Irving Howe, the critic and founder of Dissent magazine, described it as a civil war amongst intellectuals, New York intellectuals, and it really was. And so, what happens is there are all these criticisms of the book, and Arendt largely remains silent. Once or twice she responds to what she considers to be the worst of the attacks in letters to the editor, but doesn't take a public stand. And then in the German edition of the book, and then in the second edition of the English version, she publishes a postscript. And the postscript is what we're reading today. It's her attempt to answer much of the criticism that is leveled against her book in those few years. So I'm going to sort of go through the postscript and highlight what I think are the main points, and then I hope leave us plenty of time for discussion, because I think there'll be a lot to talk about. So as a strategic matter, but it's how she starts, she begins in a very dry way. She begins with her discussion of the sources and emphasizes that her book, she calls it a trial report. And she says that the main sources are two, really: the transcript of the trial, which had not been published at the time, but she had access to, and also his interrogation by the police. And she mentions a couple of other sources that she had used and not fully acknowledged in the first edition. And I should just say, and I've mentioned this before, but one of those sources is Raoul Hilberg's The Destruction of the European Jews, a book that she cites a few times in the text, but actually relies on much more heavily than she cites, and he accused her of stealing a lot of his ideas. again, not about Eichmann, but about what happened in the Holocaust. That's something we can pursue more. After she goes through these sources, she comes to the controversy, and she makes a distinction now that is going to be one that's important in a lot of her essays written in the late 60s and early 70s, between a controversy, which she calls good, in that it can lead to important ideas gaining a wide public discussion, and a campaign or an organized campaign that she calls conducted with all the well-known means of image making and opinion manipulation. This image making campaign, this PR campaign uh, that she thought was leveled against her, centered on what she called the image of a book which was never written, and touched upon subjects that had often been not mentioned by me, but had never occurred to me before. This is on page 283. So she begins with this claim that, okay, there's a good controversy, and we should actually talk about the controversy, and she's going to. But she first wants to clear the landscape, as it were, and say, most of what was criticized was not a book I wrote. And she talks about a number of things that she was criticized for that she thinks were completely irrelevant or that she never even talked about. One was that she says it was claimed that Hannah Arendt said that the Jews murdered themselves. This goes back to the question of the Judenräte that we've talked about and those Jews who did collaborate in the camps. She says that people said Jews didn't fight back. And her answer to that is, well, no one fought back, and not just the Jews. And that she says, while she did, in some sense, talk about the Jewish collaboration because it came up at the trial, she never criticized the Jewish people for not fighting back. She criticized the Jewish leadership, or some of it. And she thinks that the attack on her on this ground was completely, as she says, inflated out of all proportion, and at some points even irrelevant to what she had written. There were also criticisms of her about the German resistance movement, which she said she didn't even discuss. There was a criticism about whether anyone is entitled to sit judgment over the past, which she's going to come back to at the end of the postscript, and then whether the defendant or the victim should hold center stage. Before she gets into these controversies, she makes an important point that I just want to highlight for you on page 285. So on page 285, she says that in a controversy like this, some people will try to distort particular facts important to them. So, you can think about any controversy in the modern era, whether it's how many people were at an inauguration or about an impeachment or about how dangerous a virus is, lots of things we're talking about. And insofar as it becomes a controversy that people have organized responses to, you'll see distortions of particular facts. She says there's another part of what happens in a controversy, is that intellectuals, who she writes, are not the least interested in facts, but treat them merely as springboards for ideas, pick up the distortions to further their untrammeled inspirations. This is on page 285. And so I just want to point this out because it's something we've talked a lot about in this group and even in this text. It's Arendt's real worry that the intellectuals, and again, by intellectuals, she doesn't mean thinkers, she means intellectuals, people who are often caught up in theories and ideas that are, as she would call, anti-reality or foreign to reality. And they use facts not to actually understand reality, but to support their intellectual theories or opinions. And she gives examples of some of those. One is like Eichmann is in every one of us, which is a fact, a theory that she says facts were used to support. And if she says, if that's true, then Eichmann is himself right. He was just a scapegoat, and why should we punish him? So against the intellectuals, Arendt writes that she would never have gone to Jerusalem if she had shared these views, namely that there were sort of theories that she wanted to support with facts. She said what she went to Jerusalem to do was to observe a trial that had to take place in the interest of justice and nothing else. And so now we're back to, I guess, what I've argued in the last few weeks is the theme of the book, which is justice. And we've talked a lot about this. She says on page 287 something that I think is incredibly important. She says that punishment in a trial to do justice is to quote, and she's quoting here Grotius, who the trial court judges actually quote on this matter. He says, punishment is to defend the honor or the authority of him who is hurt by the offense, so that the failure to punish may not cause his degradation. And it's that last clause that is so important for Arendt. The reason you punish someone in law, at least in large part, is because if you fail to punish them, you degrade yourself. You degrade yourself because you don't judge, you don't take a stand. And so this is going to return us to the question of judgment and the question of justice as requiring judgment. So we punish not because you want to, it's retribution, there's an eye for an eye, and not because of deterrence, and not because you want to improve the criminal, but because to not do so morally degrades you. It allows you, it says, I reconcile with what this criminal did, and I don't think it's worth punishing. And she says, in order to uphold an ethical world, a common world, punishment is necessary so that we don't degrade ourselves and the world we live in. And so then she now comes to the sort of meat of the chapter, where I think most of us will pay attention. And she says that, okay, yes, I said that most of the book was a report of the trial, but in the epilogue I went beyond that, and the trial does raise matters beyond the facts. She says on page 287, and she says I tried to discuss those in the epilogue. And now she comes to those, and here's I think the core of the chapter. The first issue that she says the trial raises beyond the facts is the question of the banality of evil. Now, she said that she had spoken of the banality of evil on a purely factual level, pointing to the phenomena which stared one in the face at the trial. Eichmann was not Iago and not Macbeth, and nothing would have been farther from his mind than to determine with Richard III to prove a villain. So this is a point I think we've discussed, but it's good to make clear again. He wasn't someone who was out to do evil. He didn't see himself as a villain. He didn't have a desire to be a great criminal. In fact, she says in the next sentence, he had no motives at all. This is one of the more famous sentences of the book now, which includes this postscript. And it's something we're going to have to consider. What does it mean to say he had no motives at all? And then she gives one exception, except for the diligence in seeking personal advancement. He wanted to do better. He wanted to get ahead. He wanted to be a good soldier and a good bureaucrat. But he didn't actually desire to kill the Jews or destroy the Jews. That was what he had to do. And he had no motives for doing it except to do what he needed to do. And such diligence, she says, is not criminal. He merely never realized what he was doing. And then she adds to this, and I think this is one of the more important attempts to understand what the banality of evil is. She says, quote, it was his lack of imagination which enabled him to sit for months on end facing a German Jew who was conducting the police interrogation, pouring out his heart to the man and explaining again and again how it was that he reached only the rank of lieutenant colonel in the SS, and that it had not been his fault that he was not promoted. So I hope you all recalled her discussion of the interrogation of Eichmann by Captain Abner Less, which he first talks about in the book on page 28, so way back at the beginning. Captain Less spent 35 days with Eichmann and produced 3,564 typewritten pages from 76 recorder tapes. And he reports that Eichmann was in an ebullient mood, full of enthusiasm about this unique opportunity to pour everything that he knew. What is this lack of imagination that Arendt is here talking about, which she thinks is at the center of the banality of evil? It's that Eichmann could not imagine that a German Jew like Captain Abner Less, hearing Adolf Eichmann talk about his frustrations, about how he wasn't promoted, and that how he tried his best to do his job, and he kept getting frustrated with this person and that person, he couldn't understand how a German Jew might hear such a thing from someone who had been one of the participants in the Holocaust. And this lack of imagination, this inability to think, and again, to think means to let your mind go wandering, to think from the perspective of others, to see from their point of view. Eichmann was so trapped in his own world. He saw himself having suffered, and he couldn't really understand the suffering of the Jews. She says, this is not stupidity. It's not like people who are stupid. It's not someone who's not rational. She will, in another interview, call it dumbness. So, I mean, it's an interesting distinction. Stupidity is not the same as dumbness. But it was sheer thoughtlessness, she says. Something by no means identical with stupidity that predisposed him to become one of the greatest criminals of the period. So again, banality of evil doesn't mean stupid, doesn't mean it means that he wasn't a crazed fanatic. It means that he did not have imagination. And this lack of imagination of the other was sheer thoughtlessness. It's not diabolical or demonic. And so that's what she means by banal. At the same time, and I think this is really important, she doesn't mean that everyone was like Eichmann. She says that this banality, she says, is not the same as commonplace. She doesn't think that all other people, or that it's common necessarily that people act this way. Now, this brings up a question that I've touched on, but I want to use this period to actually talk about, is her argument with Stanley Milgram, right? So Stanley Milgram, who conducted these experiments in which people were asked to shock people who they thought were being tortured, but were really actors, and it was made up. But Milgram concludes that after witnessing hundreds of ordinary people submit to the authority of scientists, he writes, I must conclude that Arendt's conception of the banality of evil comes closer to the truth than one might dare imagine. Ordinary people simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part can become agents in a terrible, destructive process. And Arendt really disagrees with Milgram. On one level, she says that simply obeying within a bureaucratic system doesn't diminish responsibility. Obedience and support, she argues, are not the same. If you obey, are the same. If you obey, it's actually a moral indication of support. And so she insists that Eichmann was not simply obeying orders, but supporting a system. And so and she wants to insist that not all people will do this. And we talked about a few sessions ago how, in different Milgram experiments, sometimes more people did it, sometimes not so many. But she doesn't want to normalize this kind of obedience and support. In any case, what she says at the end of this section is that that Eichmann's, what was common about Eichmann, or what not was common, what was base about Eichmann, was that he simply really was remote from reality. that his thoughtlessness was one that protected him from the reality, namely the reality of others like Avner Liss and the German Jews. And she says that was the lesson that she took from the trial, that there was a kind of thoughtlessness that someone like Eichmann had that made him, that protected him against reality so that he could live in his own logical bubble and not have to confront realities which were uncomfortable to him. And she said that was the lesson. It was not an explanation for what happened, which is what so many intellectuals wanted to turn it into a, here's why this happened, because people are bureaucrats. That's not what she's saying. It was neither an explanation nor a theory. She's not offering a theory of why people do such a thing, unlike someone like Stanley Milgram. She's simply saying it's a lesson that we have to think about. Once we get to that, she says, now there's some other questions that arise. The first one was what kind of crime actually happened? And she says we have to start with the fact that it was an unprecedented crime. We often call it genocide, which she says is okay up to a point. But she says genocide is not great as a name because massacres of whole peoples had happened before. It really wasn't unprecedented. What she thinks it should be called is administrative massacres. And she ends with this. She ends this section with the claim that Hitler began these administrative massacres with medical mercy deaths and hoped to finish it with killing all genetically damaged Germans. It was a kind of administrative, bureaucratic process that she says, in an automated economy in the not too distant future, may tempt men to exterminate all those whose intelligent quotient is below a certain level. You see where she's going with this, I hope. That's on page 288 to 289. A second argument she wants to make is that those who make the cog theory argument, that Eichmann was only a cog, as he himself said, are wrong. In her view, such a crime can only be committed by a giant bureaucracy. That is true, and Eichmann was part of a bureaucracy. But as a crime, she says, we are concerned with human beings. And here's the real turn towards the wallop, if I can say that, of the postscript, which is going to be about judgment. Even though he was a bureaucrat, she says, in crime, we are considered with human beings. In justice, we are concerned with human beings. To say he was a cog or functionary, she says, is just like saying, or when a criminal says, well, 35% of people born with my social background and racial background and gender background and ethnic background and whatever it is commit crimes. Therefore, it was likely I committed a crime and therefore it's not my fault. And she says, that doesn't work in either case. You're still responsible in law. Those might be useful analyses in social science and ways to think about how to create better social systems. But in the law, we're actually concerned with what you do. And she says it's the nature of totalitarian government and every bureaucracy to make functionaries and mere cogs in the administrative machinery out of men and thus to dehumanize them. So this returns us to a conversation we've been having about bureaucracy. I know Bob Meyerson has been critical of Arendt's criticism of bureaucracy. But here is what she's saying, is that one of the lessons of the trial is that bureaucracy, much like totalitarian government, although we can certainly say on a different level, and we should definitely not say they're the same, but like them in the same way, can make functionaries and dehumanize men. Insofar as bureaucracies lead to the rule of nobody, she says, we have a tendency to abandon justice and not judge men. And yet she says, what is not debatable is that there are no judicial procedure would be possible without judging men outside of their role as bureaucrats or functionaries or cogs. And this leads to her final discussions of judgment. She says that Eichmann acted within the framework of rules. He acted in accordance with the rules, namely the rules of Nazi Germany. He examined the orders issued to him for its legality. He found them legal and regular. He did not fall back on his conscience because he followed the law. And she says, we have to take this seriously, that he was someone who actually was a law-abiding. His crimes were legal crimes, as she says. And she concludes, I'm going to argue on page 294 forward, that what all this shows is the inadequacy of the prevailing legal system and of current juridical concepts to deal with the facts of administrative massacres organized by state apparatus. In all trials of administrative massacres, she says, what we actually see is that the judges don't judge according to rules. They judge solely on the basis of the monstrous deeds. In other words, they judge freely. And this, she says, brings us to the problem of the nature and function of human judgment. What we demand of those like Eichmann is that even though he committed legal crimes, he is a human being and as one must be, quote, capable of telling right from wrong, even when all he has to guide him is his own judgment. Even when his judgment happens to be completely at odds with what he must regard as the unanimous opinion of all those around him. And this brings us to, I think, one of the really important insights that Arendt makes here, which is that in order to judge well, human beings need to be arrogant, right? I've probably mentioned this before, but I mean, one of the criticisms of Arendt that we see over and over again in people who knew her is that she was held to be arrogant. She was held to stand away. I mean, I've talked about it a lot here and in other forums as saying that one of the things I love about Arendt is her fearlessness, her absolute independence of thought. Jerry Cohen was just telling me the other day that a friend of Arendt's had told him once that Arendt's mother was a nicer, better person than Arendt. And when Jerry asked why, he said because Arendt had no fear. And because she had no fear, she could say anything and she could really be sort of a jerk. And it was this arrogance that on the one hand, she recognized that not all arrogant people are good judges, and some arrogant people are bad judges, and it's terrible when they take it upon themselves to judge arrogantly. And yet, it was only those who were arrogant enough to judge by their own moral maxims who were still able to tell right from wrong, who were able to resist the Nazis. And so in some way, we end with this claim for the need for a kind of judgment, a kind of arrogance, a kind of willingness to be free in one's judgment. I'll stop there. I know that was a little longer than usual as an introduction, but at this point, I'm really going to try and let you guys talk about this text, which I think is it's a marvelous conclusion to what I think is one of her great texts. I mean, a lot of people talk about Eichmann in Jerusalem as a book that's one of her most popular books, but not her best book. I think when you get deeply into it, it is one of her best books. But happy to hear your thoughts, and I'm going to let you guys lead the discussion now.
I have a question about Arendt, although I'm much more interested in the banality of the evil and the judgment aspects that you brought up really quickly, and it can be dismissed. It doesn't have to be talked about that much. Maybe nobody finds it interesting, which is a little bit what feels like either disingenuousness or being guilty of her own accusation. And again, not to Eichmann insofar as anything comparable to what he's doing, of course, and I hope I don't have to even say that, but I had to. It's the idea that she keeps claiming this is just the report of a trial, and yet has two titles, neither of which have the word trial in it. So that, I think, it reveals something about what she's truly intending to do with this book, and so that makes me a little concerned. But the bigger one is that, going back to the criticism, which I think is somewhat unfair, but at the same time, she deserves some guilt for, she has transported stories about Jewish responsibility to a community that's only 15 years removed from the actual horror. It's a scar that still and may never heal. And how could she be so thoughtless to send these knowing that they'd go towards people who would feel harm as a result of that transport? I'll leave it at that now.
Yeah, I mean, so thanks. I think those are great questions. I think it's a completely legitimate skepticism to say, was this really simply a trial report? I mean, uh, you know, clearly Arendt's presentation of the trial, and I mean, much of the book in the middle is about a history of the different ways in which Jews were expelled and then killed and deported. Is based on a huge amount of historical research. Uh, but and so I'm happy to hear what people think about that. I have my thoughts, but I think it's a legitimate skepticism, and we should continue with it. But I'm gonna let other people talk.
Get off. Get off.
Anyone want to join in?
Hey,
I'd like
Roger.
to say
Good.
something. I'd like to say something. Usually, when we think of the unthinking Eichmann, the history that we're reading it, because the book was only written in the 60s, and we're reading it today, and we're going back to try to understand how Eichmann felt, or what Eichmann thought, or his guilt in a period that existed well before the book was written. But it's interesting to me today, the applicability of it today, when, for example, we have this horrendous pandemic happening, and leaders of one country, are basically condemning people to death. Are they knowing it? Are they willing to state that people in their 60s and older should actually sacrifice themselves in order to get the economy going? This is really scary to me, because there is a sense of either they are like Eichmann, totally oblivious, or they are very much responsible for what's going on. This is guilty.
So just to say a few things to that, Daphne. Yeah, I mean, first of all, some people have explicitly said it. I mean, you heard probably the Lieutenant Governor of Texas get up and say, that older people should be willing to go to work and sacrifice for their grandchildren, and they would be happy to do so. Let's also say that there are a lot of people already doing this, many of whom are not older people. Doctors, nurses, grocery workers, delivery workers, subway workers. I think the question of, and I've, some of in the Amor Mundi, I've written a fair bit about this the last 2 weeks, and I've gotten a lot of different kind of comments. But I think there is a real question to ask about who is being asked to sacrifice, and what does it mean to be asked to sacrifice, and why is it so hard to ask people to sacrifice today? And Arendt is someone who was very worried about the fact that increasingly we live in a world in which our primary concern, our primary value, as she puts it, is keeping ourselves alive, which is an important value, and she's not going to deny it, and it's absolutely essential. But we don't have a sense of the common world and the common purpose that we are all striving to keep together, for which we would die and sacrifice. And that is a major concern of hers throughout her work. It's maybe worth, if you don't mind, I'll read a quote to you that she wrote in 1942. She wrote, "There was once a happy time when men could choose freely, better dead than a slave, better to die standing than on your knees. And there was once a wicked time when intellectuals grew feeble-minded and declared life to be the highest good. But now the dreadful time has come when every day proves that death begins his reign of terror, precisely when life becomes the highest good. That he who prefers to live on his knees will die on his knees. That no one is more easily murdered than a slave. We who are alive have to learn that you can't even live on your knees, that you don't become immortal by chasing after life, and that if you are no longer willing to die for anything, you will die for having done nothing. Now, I have no desire to say, I don't think Arendt thinks you should just give up and try and die. I don't think that's the argument at all. But I do think we at least have to, as long as we're reading her and talking about her, understand and think about what it means to live a life in which life is the highest good, and what does it mean to articulate institutions, values, and a common world for which we would struggle, sacrifice, and potentially die. And I think those are essential questions for her.
Roger, Arendt was saying, go ahead.
That sort of ties into something I wanted to ask about at the base of page 295. Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me? Okay. Where she says, the argument that we cannot judge if we were not present and involved ourselves seems to kiss everyone everywhere, although it seems obvious that if it were true, neither the administration of justice nor the writing of history would ever be possible. And what struck me about that was how much we've read and talked about her, to put it simplistically, attack on metaphysics. And it seems like what she's really striving at here is, we're not just a bunch of different individuals. There is some firmament underneath, whether it's principles, whether it's values, it's not altogether clear, but there's some sort of linkage or primacy that she's assuming or trying to show. Otherwise, as she said, nobody can really say anything, and nobody could write history, and nobody could talk about anything they happen to have been in, which is not the case. We could not be sitting here talking about this now, since none of us was alive or there then. So I was just wondering how this ties in with a very ranging attack and undermining of any attempt by intellectuals and or philosophers to write metaphysics, because this seems to be sort of on that path to me.
That's a great question, but why don't I let one or two other people join in, and then we'll try and answer them, so we get people joining in.
Roger, I was on a different tack when you were talking about the idea of citizenship, or quoting her about it. And that has to do with the fact that she was a champion of a Jewish army during World War II. And in this country, ever since Nixon, we eliminated the citizen army. So now the people who are fighting our wars are either minorities or rural people. I live in a rural area, and a lot of those people volunteer because they don't have the wherewithal to afford college, for example, or maybe they just can't see prospects. But just as Arendt championed a Jewish army, I think we need to champion a return to a citizen army, albeit with a national service component. Even during the Vietnam War, when I was very actively engaged out here in a rural area against the war, I was always in favor of the draft.
So, thank you both, Margaret and Bob.
Can I just quickly, one thing, to volunteer to fight is very different from to volunteer to die for the Dow Jones.
I'd like to. Can I take the sword to the heart right now?
Do it.
A couple things in regards to Daphne's point regarding the comments recently from Trump and the governor of Texas. These were very poorly worded and crafted things. But as somebody, my grandmother's 96 years old. She was a Rosie the Riveter. She's in a nursing home in Greensboro, North Carolina. Her sister, my aunt, is 93 years old. She raised me since I've been in third grade. She's at a lake house with her daughter in the foothills of the mountains in North Carolina trying to get away from this. Okay. The larger point isn't we want old people to die. There will come a point in this crisis. It's not now. What we're doing now, I think, is good. There will come a point in this crisis where we have to get our economy back going. We cannot hunker down for a year and a half until a vaccine is in place. The point of the matter is that millions and millions and millions of Americans, once this $1,200 stimulus checks runs out, do not have a penny to their name. The risk of civil unrest, the risk of civil unrest, the risk of people killing themselves, the risk of small business people who have lost everything, jumping out of windows like they did in the crash of 1930. The complete wreck of not the Dow Jones. No one cares about the Dow Jones for 6 months or a year. I'm talking about the Dow Jones for 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. These are all risks if we don't get back to work at some point. I'm not saying now, but just like the Londoners just like the Londoners when the Nazis were bombing London, came out of their shelters at point and went back to work. There will come a point to where we have to do that. Is it now? No. Is it 2 weeks from now? No. But I tell you what, we're not going to all be hunkered down with our ramen noodles in 6 months from now. We will not be. We will be back to work. And in places in the middle of the country, I'm in Columbus, Ohio, 2.5 million people. We have 177 cases now. We've only added 40 cases in the last week. Now, there will be some point to where people in the middle of the country in Columbus, Ohio, where there's 2.5 million people saying, okay, we have 200 cases and we're only adding 20 cases a week. There will be some point to where we're saying we're not going to be hunkered down for 18 months. And so, yes, these are poorly worded. The way it was worded I believe it was just poorly worded. There's no doubt about it. But for us to sit back thinking that we're going to be all hunkered down until a miracle vaccine comes into place is ludicrous. This country will be back to work. It has to be, or we will face something where more people will die.
Scott, are you an economist? Are you an economist, Scott? Because I am. And I think that what you are quoting now is the hunches of a person in the White House who has the podium and has absolutely no idea about the benefits of closing the economy to prevent an entire economy from being paralyzed later. So don't quote me Trump.
Listen, number one, that's an argument from authority, and I'm just one of those regular guys who shouldn't vote. If you listen to what I said that the economy should be shut down right now. But if you're an economist and you're telling me that we're going to still be all hunkered down 6 months from now, and this economy won't be destroyed, I'll take my exercise physiology degree over your economy degree. And I'm sorry, maybe I should just go to Bowling Green and study.
Can I just mention something about what Bill Gates was saying today? That's just to help clarify some of the facts. Gates was saying we need to lock down the entire country for 6 weeks, but we're not doing it. But that he's looking at preventing the economy from collapsing, in addition to minimizing the deaths. So the
6 weeks,
actual
I don't have
issue
any
is
issue with.
right. The actual issue is, and this is taking us in a new direction, so I'll just drop it. But the issue is that Trump and the other leaders are not taking drastic enough steps right now to prevent both the economic collapse and the health collapse. So that's the really scary part, in my view.
Can I add to that, Ken, just quickly to tie it back to judgment, which Roger was highlighting and Eichmann, is I think one of the things that has really been frightening me for the past week is the complete collapse between fact and fiction that is so apparent in Trump's daily press briefings. It really says something, that people have taken to Governor Cuomo over watching Trump, because he's actually turning to doctors and economists and experts, and Trump is just endlessly repeating nonsense that has no bearing on reality. And I think we're being thrown into a place of having to make judgment. Germany yesterday issued a directive saying that all citizens should get home as soon as possible because America is mishandling the crisis. I mean, that's astounding. That's really astounding. And I think this very much bears on the loss of judgment that we've been talking about collectively for the past several years, and that's come up a lot in this group.
I think there is going back to just the concept of judgment as opposed to the particulars of the time we're in, as much as I think that's critical too. To just look at a book and not notice what's going on would be crazy. I hope that's the point of doing this exercise that we've done for the past few weeks. But I think one can have a judgment, a moral judgment that something is wrong and still do it. We're acting as though a moral judgment is always the guide of every behavior, and there are countervailing forces. And I think Arendt even mentions it in talking about emergency situations in a state where wrong things are done nonetheless. And I'm not just saying for utilitarian purposes, but I guess maybe I am. It's a cost-benefit analysis. I'm not saying that the economy should take precedence over life. And again, if people are recommending people go back to work, it should begin with them. But if they do it, I'd like to see them do it in an incredibly isolated condition. It's different from a bombing in England, where if I go out while bombs are falling, I'm the one who's going to pay a price, nobody else. Whereas right now, if we go out while this virus bomb is falling, we basically become the bomb ourselves. So that's, I think, the problem of allowing a society to be leaderless in a way. They're people who are trying to manage. They're not leaders. Managers do things right. Leaders do the right thing. I don't see that happening at the moment.
Great. Some really fantastic comments. I'm gonna try and keep it on the question of judgment to the extent I can, because I think that's where it goes. So Margaret got us started on this discussion by asking about the quote on page 295, the argument at the bottom, the argument that we cannot judge if we were not present and involved ourselves, seems to convince everyone everywhere, although it seems obvious that if it were true, neither the administration of justice nor the writing of history would ever be possible. I mean, this is a theme Arendt returns to many times. She often calls it the problem of a fear of judging, and she associates it with a number of parts of modern society. One is the rise of social science, in which increasingly we seek to explain things like Stanley Milgram does, and it's no accident that this quote that Margaret turned us to comes right after her mention of not Milgram per se, but she says American literati who have professed their naive belief that temptation and coercion are really the same thing. She's actually referring here, I think, to Lionel Abel in the Partisan Review, but it's similar to her critique of Stanley Milgram, which simply says that since people will obey, then it's okay to obey. And what she's trying to say is, no, I mean, if you think that way, you can't do law. You can't put people on trial. And if you can't put people, and you could say, and by the way, there are many social scientists who've said we shouldn't. They say law is an outmoded ideal in the modern age. Instead of punishing people, we should seek to control them. We should seek to control their behavior. So it uses kind of situationalist, behavioralist logic and says the point is to train people to behave and not to punish them, because punishment doesn't accomplish anything. Arendt's answer to that, which I quoted in at the beginning, is to say, well, there's a reason we punish, and it's not deterrence and it's not retribution. It's to, again, to citing Grotius, it's to say, because if we don't, we degrade ourselves. And so this, I don't know if this goes against what Peter was just saying at the end. It might, because her argument really is that, yeah, there are times when we have to make judgments that are morally wrong, but are right in the situation. And, one example would be, again, torturing to find out where a ticking nuclear bomb is in the middle of New York. And, I think, or as she says in this book, assassinating Eichmann instead of kidnapping him could have been such a judgment. Those kind of judgments can be right, and we need to be willing to have the arrogance to make such judgments. That's, to me, and that's a dangerous claim, and she realizes this, because she says some people who make such arrogant judgments will be Hitlers, but many of them will be resistors. And so part of her worry, and the reason we don't make judgments today, is the rise of social science takes us away from this arrogance of judgment and turns us onto rules and norms. Another reason she'll cite is the rise of relativism, and the sense of who's right and no one's right and there is no moral good. There are a bunch, but for Arendt, the overriding point is that it's absolutely imperative, if human society is to remain human and justice is to continue to exist, that we be willing to make such judgments outside the rules, such extraordinary, arrogant judgments. And that's her claim. And it's a controversial claim. And it's one that she sees as dangerous. But she thinks that's the lesson she draws from this trial.
I mean, people, the Nazis misunderstood Nietzsche and felt they were the courageous ones. They thought they were being incredibly brave by cutting off this part of the body of Germany that they felt was damaging it and the world's order. I guess the question for me is what is the lesson? I love the fact that she focused on Eichmann. I love the fact that, although she, I guess, sounds like she would disagree with me, from all of you who know Arendt better than I, but she's showing that there's something about the norm of us, the average of us. We're not hopefully we're not the survivor, and well, survivor would be great, but most people didn't survive. Hopefully we're not not hopefully again, the rescuer, the survivor, and the killer are the outliers. Hardly anybody did those three things. Most people were going about their business trying to make whatever life they could inside a world that had seemed to be going upside down. If that's the case, to expect us to become heroes, I think, is a lot to ask. I don't know how we would transform into that heroic, brave type. Maybe our leaders will do it, but then we run the risk the leader will either be a Roosevelt or a Hitler. And again, Roosevelt took a lot of liberties and tried to take some liberties against the Constitution, which is not a suicide pact, but it nonetheless is some, at least, agreed upon format by which we'll live our lives. I think the better thing is to understand about ourselves that we could do things that we would never think possible, which I think is the lesson from social psychology and Milgram types and Zimbardo types. And that should get us to start thinking about alternative solutions to how to prevent disaster going forward. If we continue to lie to ourselves that we'll become heroes, I think we'll go the way of heroes during the Holocaust.
Does this come back to the question of action? I mean, having the uncertainty of taking action. And knowing that anytime that action is engaged in, you cannot anticipate what the result will be. That is not quantifiable because the narratives interact, commingle, and turn into something else.
Yeah, I was gonna mention something like that. Going back to her essay, Tradition in the Modern Age, where she basically looks at the distinction between action and thought, where Plato basically turns away from the human affairs world and basically tries to find truth in thought. But when Marx basically ends the tradition saying that it's not thought, it's not theories, it's what happens in this world that determines the historical process. That's what really matters in the end, and that's what happens is the Holocaust happened, and other things will happen in the future, and it's not dependent on whatever theoretical utopia we can create, but how we act as a result of that.
I want to add, if I may, I want to go back for just a second to the idea of the heroic act, resisting evil or being willing to die and so on and so forth. This, of course, ends up being a slogan called "Live Free or Die," which turns out to be a slogan for individualism, and that might fit well with Arendt's concept of pluralism, that is, that each individual makes the decision as to how he or she will live. But in a time like this, where the only response to the challenge, to an emergency of this type, the only possible success resides in total unanimity of the community, that if people are allowed to follow their own personal opinions within this crisis, then it only extends the crisis and makes things worse. So I would want to challenge her to say, to be arrogant enough to tell me, nevertheless, people should do whatever they think is right, whatever the consequences may be, as long as they are making judgments in some moral sense that is really true to their own beliefs.
I'll say something a little going back to the action issue. I'll say something that maybe is patently obvious. I mean, it is contained in kind of a Zen Konish, sorry to mix religions, part of the Talmud, which is the question of what's more important, study or practice. And the answer is usually, the answer I understand it is study, because it leads to practice, which is kind of a revolving door, because then practice is the most important. But only practice that has been studied for is the most important, but only study that leads to practice is the most important, et cetera, et cetera. They're totally inseparable married actions or married parts of the human experience.
So this is a great conversation, and it leads to some important questions, and some of which I don't know if I have a good answer to. But to respond to one thing Jack said, I don't think Arendt is rightly thought of in this way as an individualist. I mean, clearly she does believe that there's a private world in which we all act and think on our own, and that's an important part of what she imagines human life is. There is a unique realm for the unique, which she calls the private. But action, which she calls courageous, not necessarily heroic, but courageous, happens when we put the world over our own safety, and the world's existence and the world's persistence over our own personal safety. So I certainly don't think that's an individualist approach. I'm not sure it would be right to call it a collectivist approach or not. I don't think it is. I don't think it's a Marxist idea of action, in which action, I think Rob's point, going back to the tradition of the modern age, is good. But Arendt thinks of Marx still as part of the tradition because his idea of action is still caught up in thought and theories. And I think to me, and so here's the end of where I know, and here's where I begin to think, and I realize that my thoughts on this are potentially wrong, because a number of people who know Arendt well and I have been arguing about this quite strenuously the last 3 or 4 days. Insofar as Arendt believes that action is for the sake of a world, right? One of her, I think, strongest convictions, and I think it's in the essay tradition in the modern age, if I'm not mistaken, Rob, is that the problem today, she says, is that we all know what we're fighting against. We don't, but none of us know what we're fighting for. And I take that to be another way of saying we've lost the world. We've lost the sense that the world we live in is something lovable, meaningful, full of institutions and practices and habits that are worth sacrificing for. And so to go back, and again, I don't want to bring up Trump or any of that, but to go back to the argument that Daphne and Scott were having to some degree, it strikes me that the Arendtian question, as I at least understand it, and again, I'm happy to be told here that I'm barking up the wrong tree, that the Arendtian question is something along the lines of, what does it mean in the face of a crisis like the coronavirus to act in the name of a world, and act courageously in the name of the world? And I think there's more than one answer, and one answer has to be that in order to preserve the world, which we value to some degree and for some amount of time, we are all going to have to shelter ourselves in place, or lock down, or do whatever it is. It seems that's one of the only ways that the world can be preserved. And yet, if we make keeping people alive such a high priority that we give up on certain aspects of the world, like funerals, visiting our relatives, human contact, engagement with others, the dignity of having a business. This is not about profit. This is about building a life. And I think it's too easy to say profit over lives. I don't think that's what a lot of people are talking about. I think people are talking about, is my life that I've built for 20 years with a business and a family, and is that sustainable or not? And if we give up on all that and we don't see that as part of our world, what does that mean? And so, again, I think you have to put both in the balance. And I think that's the kind of question that Arendt helps us frame in this particular crisis. But that's where I'm out on a limb, so I'm happy to hear other people's thoughts on it.
I just
Yeah,
like to
you were
say
right.
that I wasn't trying to be facile when I meant that I don't consider the value of work, or that I don't consider the value of human lives and all the work that has gone into it. Obviously, that's very crucial. But the fact that a leader in our day, after all the history that we have experienced, can stand there and basically utter a sentiment like that, which leads other leaders who follow him blindly to promote this, is terrifying. And I think that it's very important, even in Arendtian terms, to question that, because we have to fight that. The value of a human life is not up to someone else to decide for us. That's my biggest concern.
To support Scott, I believe, like Scott, this can't go on forever. The shutdown can't go on forever. And as you said, Roger, a balance has to be struck. Now, there may be a lot of lives lost. There were a lot of lives lost in 1918, 1919, but that's the train. I'm close to a train, if you can hear it. But nevertheless, at some point, we'll be beyond it. I hope I'll be beyond it, but I'm one of the more vulnerable. And the balance will tip in favor of the one. Now, of course, in 1918-19, there was a second wave, and Dr. Fauci is talking about that. So maybe we'll get knocked down and pop back up, and then a little while later we'll get knocked down again. But nevertheless, the economy also has to be given its due.
You can imagine, though, that if you wind back a bit and you look at what happened during the Black Death, you had this dramatic loss of life amongst the labor class. And as a result, a lot of people who weren't included in the labor class suddenly stepped forward. And so there was this dramatic increase in the number of women in the workforce and in the managerial positions even, which some have attributed to later persecution of women that led to witch trials and so on and so forth to try and rebalance the power dynamic that was pre-Black Death. And so I think we can look at a much longer time span for a crisis such as this and go, there's going to be much bigger issues than the 6-month or the 12-month concerns here. This is really possibly singularity-esque in that it really can be changing the way we're going to be operating.
If I can join in, right now there's not much action that any of us can take except keep washing our hands and participating in virtual reading discussions and Zoom things. It seems to me that if there is action, it's at the highest level right now. We're all looking at the news conferences that Trump holds every day, and what strikes me about it is his failure to act. I see ineptitude as much as anything else. Fauci has a responsibility for ending this virus as fast as possible. Trump's responsibility is bigger than that. It does include the economy. He has to think about that. That's his job. And the economy, as Scott has said, is terribly important to us in lots of different ways. In addressing that, he is influenced a lot by his support, much of which is Christian evangelicals who say that this is not a problem. God wouldn't do this to us. He wants us to gather together. He has a lot of people who say it's a hoax still. It's his job to lead and to express a plan or a pattern that will address both the economy and the virus. And he is not doing that. And I think he's timid in a way. It's the banality of his leadership in a way that I think is what we're seeing right now.
Could it be that the economic results of this situation with the disease could be sort of the beginning of realizing there's going to be an economic change anyway? When we talk about jobs, which of course, everybody agrees with Scott, people have to get back to work eventually. But the idea that we will always have jobs that exist now is going to be changed with technology and other situations. So it's as if we're starting on a terrible way to start that kind of a discussion, but it is going to have to happen. And the one thing will happen, people will realize how extraordinarily wealthy this country is when, these kinds of plans come out and they'll be hopefully successful. But they'll have to lead to bigger and better, not bigger, at least bigger, more comprehensive economic policies that will account for the changes that will be taking place in the world itself, I think.
just a quick tail to Frank's last comment. I think back to Hannah Arendt's idea that one of the ways that we need our leaders to be is to have them make us feel that we are useful. And my 91-year-old mother feels really useful sheltering in place because she feels she might be saving a life. And those of us who are gathering masks are feeling useful because we're doing something. So one of the jobs of our leaders should be, the way Hannah Arendt has said, to give us some sense of context in the middle of all this. And I think that would have alleviated a lot of the anxieties that we have going forward.
That just to add to that, that touches on something I've been thinking about in Arendt's conception of action and what it means to act right now. You know, for her, if acting means acting together in concert in a public sphere, and our public sphere has shrunk in terms of being able to actually physically appear in front of one another, who are the people that are acting right now? I don't know if Barry Weiss wrote an incredible piece in the New York Times yesterday about the stories about some of the doctors who are on the front lines of this crisis, which is really worth reading. And, you know, they're the ones who are acting, the people who are helping source medical supplies and who are treating the patients. And I think, you know, one of the questions I've been thinking about in terms of Arendtian thinking is what is actually the role for political thinkers right now? Because we seem rather useless in a lot of ways, because we can't actually, you know, help save lives. But I think meaning, you know, Arendt talking about meaning and storytelling and the ability to tell narratives is where we can also find meaning and purpose in terms of our relationships to one another and the work that we're doing.
Yeah, Sam, I think that's right, and I think it goes very much in line with what I was trying to say about the need to articulate what is meaningful in our world. I mean, in many ways, what we're doing here today, the 42 of us talking together, you know, we're reading Arendt, and I hope people, if you have questions about the text, we're still happy to go back to it. But one of the core arguments of the text, right? And I just want to say, if I can make this connection one more time, is that the reason Arendt says you judge Eichmann is not because he broke the law, right? The legal system has been inadequate to it. It's because at times when something like the Holocaust happened, it throws the entire world and the meaning of the world into doubt. And we need judgment, free judgment, not legal judgment, free political judgment, to sort of say, this should not have happened. And that's what she thinks the judgment of Eichmann is about. It's not about he broke a law or he acted wrongly or he killed people. It's that things like this that happen, we need collectively to say, no, it's inconsistent, it's incompatible with the world we live in. We need to not reconcile to it. So now we're in another crisis, and we all have to make judgments. Do we go inside, stay inside, outside, etc.? And I think part of what she's saying is, in some ways, we all have to, you know, be arrogant enough to make judgments. Now, I think a lot of that right now is you have to stay inside, not because they're telling you to, because it's the right thing to do. But it also means we need to begin figuring out ways, staying inside, to tell the stories and to bring a meaning and a coherence to a world worth saving. And that's what Arendt reminds us of. We have to be willing to make judgments, whether it's of the president and the leadership he's offering or non-leadership he's offering, or of people who are holding, you know, rallies and going to the beach and doing things and judging these people and not saying, oh, well, don't judge them, they're young, or who are you to judge, you know, whatever. I actually think this is a time where people should be, you know, making judgments about what people should be doing and arguing over it. And unfortunately, that's hard to do when we're all stuck in our little rooms. And that's why collective experiences like this, to the extent that they matter and are possible, are important, because they give us a chance to articulate what is meaningful. So I hope that's what we're going to do.
I'm really curious to. Okay. I'm really curious whether over digital video chat can create the public sphere that Arendt was talking about. Because there is this kind of aspect of being digital where I can immediately remove myself from the room and remove myself from condemnation just because I'm not in the physical presence of. And is that a part of what makes a public sphere that we have to basically be vulnerable in a sense to once I say what I believe and someone disagrees with me and I feel threatened, I can leave. Is that a public sphere or not? Can we create an environment online like this such that we can have a public sphere, such that we can have some kind of natural authority which we can look to when we're trying to make decisions on what's the right decision to make, whether that's staying inside, whether that's doing something else?
That's a great
I would say under the circumstances, yes, but a digital world, and we have GoToMeeting, which we've started using, it's just not as good as face-to-face. You know, you lose something, you lose nuance, you lose the people who are on the side maybe looking at their own devices, maybe some expressions, maybe some noises, maybe people talking over one another as we're doing here. So under current circumstances, yes, but generally speaking, it's not as good.
I want to say it's not as good, Bob, but I've been impressed by keep on thinking about around talking about I don't know, I guess the willingness to appear or the world of appearances and all that, and just how much more powerful it is for us to be willing to show our faces in this system, and how interesting it is that the power of this. And when we look at a grid view of the people, and I do that sometimes, and just sort of feel this bonding and stuff. It's not as good as meeting in person, but in other ways, it's broader. It's I'm connecting with people I haven't connected with in a long time, and yeah, it's a new time.
I don't want more.
I just want to say, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please. I can wait.
I'll be quick. First, I want to say, Roger, your last set of comments I thought were very important. Very good. I really appreciate them. As regards, and in connection with that, Hannah Arendt herself, I'm sure she had many personal face-to-face arguments with people. I never met her or anything, but I'm sure that that's the case, everything I knew. But her real impact was indirect, was through articles that she wrote, letters that she wrote, essays, and so forth. And she took a chance. She stuck her neck out every time. I'm thinking even now when we're all trapped in our little rooms, in our little houses and so forth, and we still can write letters and participate in things of this sort. And it is possible to have some effect. Maybe we can try an essay or something like that on our own, and adopt some of Arendt's arrogance in doing that.
I was going to say that I don't want a lot more pandemics, but I think it has brought out incredible clarity about some of our values of what we really do care about, what brings us joy. Being able to see people on internet isn't as good as face-to-face, but it's still damn good. Having a reading group that maybe I would have put off because so many other things keep me so busy. This has been great to stay part of this. Saying good morning to people on the street as opposed to keeping my head down. Granted, you don't see that many people. But I do think there are some legitimate questions about going back to something I think Roger said before, about the deep decisions we have to make, which is about people in the present. There's folks who talk about folks who are on ventilators right now who have limited life contingencies going forward. Do you take the ventilators from them? These are legitimate questions that ethicists and leaders have to make decisions on. Having said that, there was a good article from someone in the Times arguing for not giving up on the right of those who are disabled to have the same chance for life as anyone else. But similarly, the right of people today versus the future generations or future people, these are legitimate questions too, which get back to the debate about staying in place, but also keeping the economy going, and the power of each of those to cause unintended consequences and untold casualties. I do think necessity is the mother of invention. I think we, in the midst of this time, are coming up with all sorts of imaginative responses. It doesn't have to be the old way we do things. It can be new ways in which we do things, including even going back to when we had the gas crisis. Maybe only people with the last number that is odd work on Mondays and even work on Tuesdays. You can keep not social isolation, but social distance possible and still go back to work. I'm sure there's something wrong with that idea, or somebody would suggest it, but there are ideas that will come up that will give us a chance to do a little balancing on these two horrible dilemmas we're facing and come up with a solution that takes everybody as much as we can into our consideration. And I'm confident we'll come up with that because we need to.
Peter, I agree with you. Along those lines, one of the things that we've heard, and something I do know a little bit about, being a physiologist and a life science background, is, there's one of the misinformations out there is that wearing a face mask is not protective at all. It actually is very protective. It's not perfect, but it is very protective. And one of the reasons that it hasn't been brought up is that we just don't have the supply to. That priority has to go to the doctors and medical workers for those masks. But if you look in like South Korea, where they are keeping their economy afloat, everybody, when they go out, they wear a mask. Is it perfect? No, but it is. And if it didn't have any effect, doctors wouldn't wear the mask, nurses wouldn't wear the mask, the people in the hospital wouldn't wear the mask. The reason that we're not wearing masks right now is because that's where the priority has to go. If, I wouldn't be surprised. I don't have any inside information. Obviously, I don't have any inside information on this one, but I would not be surprised if 6 weeks from now, 3 months from now, that will be the protocol for being out in the general space. Things like football games and concerts, those will all still be canceled, but people will be working at fast food restaurants, people will be working at hotels, and it will be expected that you wear a face mask, and that's, and if you look at, like, once again, if you look at South Korea, that's pretty much, how they're managing the system. We just don't have the supply for 330 million people to have a face mask. So that would be something that, and to go back, not to dwell on past arguments, but I agree with a lockdown. I'm just saying that a lockdown's not going to happen until the vaccine is here. That's just not going to happen. There will be some type of social distancing, but in terms of like locking people in their homes and no one can go to work for 18 months, that won't happen. That won't happen. The global economy will completely shut down. And so I think a face mask is something that you're going to see at some point. That'll be a step in that direction where, like Peter, you said, I like the idea with a license plate number, so many people work on this day or that day, or it may be the fact that, at some point we have to have herd immunity at some point. It may be at some point that kids go back to school in the fall, and a lot of those kids are going to catch it and never even know about it, and then they're going to become immune. The other thing that we need in terms of testing is, right now the testing is sorely lacking, but there's two types of tests. And the one test if you actually have the virus. The other test is if you actually have the antibodies for the virus. And so there are people out there that may have had COVID and recovered, but never even knew they had it. And that would be a good thing, because those people are probably immune. And so if we can get those tests that test the antibodies, what could happen is I'm just making up a number of 1,000 people. Let's say, to make the math easy, but it would be on a wide scale basis. 1,000 people get the test for the antibodies, and we find out that 400 have the antibodies. That means they're immune. That means those 400 people could go back into the economy. They could go into nursing homes. They could go into hospitals, and because they're immune. But the tests that but we're not testing people with that test now because we don't have it. So there's two types of tests, one that tests if you have the disease and one that tests if you have immunity. And if we can test people on a wide scale, find out those people who have immunity, those people can go back into the workforce. And so that'll be another step in this whole process.
But as an exercise physiologist, you're in a unique position where you could send us and others some exercises we could do while we're cooped up. Maybe you've already done it. Maybe you've written a book, but why don't you consider that?
I'll certainly do that. I'll certainly do that. Thanks, Bob. I appreciate it.
I wanted to go back to something Roger said about a world worth saving, because I'm really struggling with that. When you see that, for example, part of the reason we're so unprepared is because our medical system is so privatized. And so I guess I feel as though going back to business as usual, if that were successful in doing that, is not really the world that I think is worth saving. So I think a lot of our institutions, the failure is because they were not working. There were so many flaws and inequalities. So I'm struggling with that idea about how do you feel that it is a world worth saving.
It's the only one we got, right? But
Susan, I might, let me throw something at you on that one. I actually heard a really great speaker on the question of what happened when the Soviet Union fell back in the early 90s. And the response when the major systems that upheld the government and upheld services, the services, including transportation, fell apart, and how the local populace simply got to work. They pulled up their boots and they went out to the fields and they planted urban gardens because they weren't getting shipments of food. It wasn't coming. The trains weren't moving in the new Russian Republic. And this is possibly, exactly, Susan, exactly, that we're probably going to be really questioning fundamentals. We're going to probably wind up jettisoning a lot of fluff that has been crusted onto our institutions, and they're going to be coming into very sharp relief as we begin to go, wait a minute, what actually gets this done?
I'd just like to add something here.
That's only if we.
I'm sorry, Peter.
Go ahead.
I just want to add something here about something actually that Peter and Frank said earlier about our conversation as being a kind of a way out of isolation. I actually was alive during the Holocaust, and I remember, although I was a child, very clearly how we got word in the synagogue about what was happening in Europe, and when we told other people, they refused to believe it. They just thought we were making it up. There was no possibility that this was true. So confronting the Holocaust at that time was a very difficult thing to do outside of being in Europe. And I'm thinking that today we are confronted with something as large, very different in character, but certainly as large as the Holocaust. It's really quite possible, if this is mismanaged, that many more people will die on account of this than ever did in the Holocaust or even in World War II total. So it's possible. I'm not saying it's going to happen. And a real question is there a way for us to use the technology that enables us to understand that to actually fight? And I don't know the answer to that question. I'm posing that as a question. I'm puzzled in the same way that Roger is, which is I have some ideas about things that could happen, but I have no idea as to whether I'm making any sense or not when I discuss that. Is it possible for us at all? When I say us, I don't mean only those of us in this conversation, but all of us who are engaged in communicating through the new media. Is there any way for us to use that to build a new world?
We've got to be much more politically active, as much as we've gotten a little more so. And it's true, people don't believe. Felix Frankfurter didn't believe what was going on in the Holocaust either when confronted with actual evidence of it from Karski. but I do worry that a president might say, I'm not sure we need to spend that much money on ventilators, so we've got to be willing to waste as much money on education and health as we do on military procurement.
So, a few things to bring us to a close because we're at that moment. But one is the rejection of facts, the refusal of reality, which is one of the main themes of Arendt's work, and which she saw both in Eichmann, but also in people's response to her book. And it's a danger of those who are politicizing facts in partisan ways, but it's also a danger of intellectuals who mobilize facts to make their own theories sound good. The refusal of facts by politicians, of reality by politicians and by theorists and by all, is the great danger to the world. Because the world, for Arendt, is that which we share. And when we all have our own facts and we all have our own theories, that's when the world breaks apart. What does it mean to fight for a world, to love a world? Which is a question was just asked, and I think it's the right question. Again, we can talk about, well, do we want to fight for a world with private hospitals that are failing? I mean, I don't want to get too political, but hospitals are failing in all sorts of countries, with public hospitals, with private hospitals. I think our problems go much deeper than public or private hospitals. What does it mean to fight to love the world? It means that somehow we find what is lovable in the world, in spite of all the horrific aspects of it that we see. In spite of the tragedy, somehow we understand that there is a world, somehow a common world that we share with others that we're willing to fight for. Is it the same for all of us? Maybe not. And yet somehow we have to be willing to make those judgments. We have to have the arrogance, I think, for Arendt to make those judgments about what is worth fighting for. And we may disagree. And some people may be totally evil in our view, and other people may just be wrong, and some people may we slightly disagree. But we have to be willing to fight for them, have the courage to do it. And in that courage to fight is, I think, how at some point others will see us, we will appear, they will appear, and over time, and it may be a long time, decades, maybe centuries, a world will emerge that people begin to find meaning in together. There's a line that Arendt uses in a number of her essays where she says that writing and thinking about piety and justice will make the world more pious and just. That's an extraordinary claim if you actually, tease it out. What she's saying is that simply in my arguing what I think is right and just and pious, and you're arguing, as we talk about it, we will build communities. We will build a world, even if we disagree. Eventually, we will start to build connections and meaningful connections that will make the world more beautiful, more pious, and more just. And so that is, I think, why judgments, making judgments, talking, saying, appearing, having the courage to appear in public is such an important idea for her. Even when it seems like the world is fractured and broken and unjust and impious, she has this incredible hope. It comes from her belief in human spontaneity and natality, but it also comes from this conviction she has to love the world, amor mundi, which is this idea she never really writes so much about in her published work, but which is in her notebooks and some of her letters that, we've made a lot of, some of us Arendt scholars, that somehow, even when it seems incredible, impossible to do so, we commit ourselves to fighting over the world. And that's what it means to love the world for her. And I think in this reading group, we actually have been pretty successful in doing that. I do believe it's much easier to do face to face for many of the reasons Bob Meyerson was talking about. I find it much harder to teach a class online. But for many of you, you've been doing this now for 4 or 5 years with us. And as those of you who stay and those come in, we do create some sort of a community here, which is our own little community and world. And I really appreciate that and thank you for it. We're going to spend the next 2 sessions, the next 2 Fridays, reading her essay on violence, which I've been teaching a lot lately, and I think is one of the most important essays of hers today. And so I thought it would be worth reading. So we'll meet again next Friday to talk about it. One thing I'll say is that if you read the essay, there are long appendices, sort of like footnotes, throughout the essay. Often those appendices are actually as interesting as anything else in the text, so don't ignore them if you have time. In any case, I really appreciate you all continuing to be here during what's obviously a trying time for us all. Be safe, be well, and continue making judgments while you read Hannah Arendt. Thank you all very much. Take care.
Thanks, Roger.
Everybody.